This is our second episode in our latest season, covering unsolved homicides across the United States, and the second in a two-part series. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This two-part series discusses drug use, violence, crime scenes, autopsy, homicide, and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. If you or a loved one is struggling with suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 or 911 if there's an immediate emergency or crisis. This is The Fall Line. Last time, we began the story of Catrina Mowrey and introduced you to her niece, also named Catrina, in honor of her aunt. As in our last episode, we'll refer to her as Catrina Marshall throughout to avoid confusion. Catrina Marshall has been advocating for her aunt since 2020, and we're working with her to get the case out to a wider audience. Catrina Mowrey was a young woman who'd moved to Dallas, Texas from Lawrence, Kansas when she was just 18. She was one of 5 siblings and the eldest of 3 girls in the family. Catrina had followed her middle sister Joanne to Texas sometime after her 18th birthday and began work at a local country club. But she returned to Kansas often, and she stayed in close contact with her youngest sister Deborah, who was her best friend. Catrina had endured a difficult period following a January 1984 car wreck in Missouri that left her with serious back injuries requiring months of recovery. She'd been prescribed pain medication during that time and used a wheelchair until the bones in her back had healed. Catrina didn't know a lot of people in Dallas. Outside of her sister Joanne and the women at her job, there were 2 significant men in her life that we know of. Pee-wee, a longtime friend who was romantically interested in her, and John, her boyfriend, who loaned her his car and was allegedly involved in Dallas's drug trade. Catrina herself had a possession arrest from November of 1984 that was ultimately dismissed, and based on what her niece and advocate has been able to discover, didn't have any serious involvement in Dallas's drug scene. According to her niece, she'd shared a small amount of her prescription pain medication with Pee-wee, but had weaned herself off painkillers by the summer of 1985. Pee-wee's interest in her and his suspected drug dependence, either factor may have created tension in their friendship. We also know of a third man, Alex, who was an acquaintance of Catrina's. He forced his way into her Dallas apartment in late May. Alex had kicked in her door, and police found them struggling inside. And Alex had a gun. Though Catrina had called 911 in fear for her life, she declined to press charges. She claimed that she'd owed Alex money, and he'd shown up when he couldn't reach her to collect it. As a reminder, we are using aliases for all 3 of these men during our series. The last time Catrina spoke with her sister Deborah was June 18th, just 2 weeks after Alex kicked in her apartment door. Catrina had plans to leave for Kansas very soon. She'd packed her bags and would drive cross-state in John's 1978 blue Ford LTD. What day she planned to arrive, we're not sure. Deborah and Catrina got into an argument that day, and they didn't speak again. Deborah assumed that her sister would arrive in Kansas City, and all would be well between them. But Catrina never arrived. Tuesday, June 25th, a little over 6 miles from Catrina's apartment in an area called Oak Cliff, a call came in to Dallas PD to report there was a blue Ford LTD parked in an alley behind the South Oak Cliff apartment complex. There'd been complaints about a foul odor. When officers investigated, they discovered Catrina's body in the trunk. According to the Dallas Morning News, her body was, quote, badly decomposed and had, quote, been wrapped in a sheet. There was a ligature around her neck, too. Police initially suspected Catrina had died of a drug overdose, and that was reported as a likelihood in the Dallas Morning News. According to her niece, it was suggested to the family back in Kansas that Catrina might have died by suicide, but her niece's mother, Deborah, she never believed that. And based on what we know now about the crime scene, her instincts were correct. Toxicology would later prove that Catrina had no drugs or alcohol in her system, but those results weren't shared with the family. Catrina's sister Deborah always believed her sister had been murdered. But how Dallas police actually classified Catrina's case and thus investigated it, that was less clear. We have to separate what we know now about Catrina's case from what was known by her family when she died in 1985. Her niece, Catrina Marshall, wasn't born yet, but her mother, Deborah, told her stories, how Deborah had followed up with Dallas police over the years and hoped for some update that would give her more information on what truly happened to her sister. We don't think that Deborah knew much, if anything, about the break-in that had occurred at Catrina's apartment, or her acquaintance with Alex, the man who'd threatened Catrina with a gun. We also don't think she knew much about John, the man that Catrina had been dating. But she was very familiar with Pee-wee, Catrina's friend. They'd known each other for years and had even been roommates for some time. Deborah had concerns that his interest in Catrina, or the exchange of prescription painkillers between them, could have led to a conflict. But it was only a suspicion. Without solid proof, Deborah had to spend the rest of her life wondering and hoping for an update. When we left off last time, we told you that the last contact that anyone in the family had with Catrina was a phone call between Deborah and Catrina on June 18th. The first question we had for Catrina Mowrey's niece, Catrina Marshall, was whether her mother was concerned by anything her sister had expressed when they spoke. We knew that the two had fought, but not what they'd spoken about. But the trouble was, Deborah couldn't recall what they'd actually discussed. Maybe it was the shock of finding out what had happened to her sister.
She said it was so stupid and she regrets it so much. She couldn't even hardly bring it to the forefront of her mind without losing her composure, really. She just said that it was something that was so stupid and that she regrets it every single day of her life. And she hates that that was the last time they ever talked to each other, because she never got to talk to her again after that. And she said it was something so stupid and petty, just like, I guess sister life. My daughters fight all the time, but I guess she just said that they got into an argument about something and my mom said something to her and then just, slammed the phone down, because you could do that back then. So, yeah, I know that was one of her biggest regrets. And that's why she always, before we hung up the phone, any time we were talking, no matter where I was at, what I was doing, how long we talked, she always made me say, I love you, before we hung up. And as a teenager, it was so annoying and I hated it, but I see why now.
But Deborah did spend a lot of time thinking over what she did know and what she did remember. Last time, we explained why Deborah had suspicions of her sister's friend Pee-wee, who was the only person she could think of as a possible person of interest in her sister's death. We also told you that since 2020, Catrina's niece and namesake, Catrina Marshall, has been the primary advocate for her aunt. To explain how that happened and the way she uncovered so many details, like additional persons of interest in her aunt's death, we need to tell you more about Catrina Marshall herself. In the first episode, we explained a little of how she was introduced to her aunts Catrina and Joanne Mowrey. Her aunt Catrina died before she was born, and her aunt Joanne was murdered in 1993, when Catrina Marshall was still a toddler. Joanne's murder was solved, but the loss of both her sisters had an incredible impact on Deborah, and it shaped Catrina Marshall's life too. Catrina Marshall's mother and father met in Kansas, and though they were only married a few years, they maintained a strong co-parenting relationship. Because Catrina's father was a long-haul truck driver, he'd spend time with her on the weekends, and that was the rhythm of her life for a long time. But then, Deborah was convicted in 1998 of theft, burglary, and attempted robbery, and she was sentenced to several years in prison. So, Catrina Marshall went to live with her maternal grandparents.
My dad was a truck driver at the time, over the road, so I couldn't go live with him. So I had to go live with my grandparents, which is how I ended up with them during my mom's incarceration. And so it was actually my favorite time period of my childhood, I would say, 100%. It was the most carefree, stable, structured, and just routine childhood. Like my grandmother and my grandfather, we had a 10-acre farm in North Lawrence, Kansas. I was used to, going with my mom to the cemetery and visiting them and talking about them openly and their personalities and hearing stories randomly. And it was just free, you could talk about anything. My mom was just so non-judgmental about anything. She was always rooting for the underdog, very sensitive and encouraging. And I noticed when I had moved in with my grandparents that if I brought it up or asked a question, I'd get immediately hushed or it was not up for discussion, period. And then my grandmother drove me every single weekend to visit my mom at the prison, which was about 30 minutes away, 40 minutes away or something. She was in the Topeka Correctional Facility for Women. I think it was 98 to 2001 or 2002, maybe. I don't think she had to do her whole sentence. She had good behavior or something and got out a little early. But she worked a job the whole time she was there and sent me all the money she made and stuff to help support me and all that. My mom, she was sharp. She was very focused and driven, and she was working a full-time job while she was in there, and they got to wear normal clothes and stuff. And she sent me and my grandmother all the money she made from her job to help buy school clothes or school supplies or whatever it was at the time,
When Deborah was released, she worked as a journalist, and she focused on her daughter, her life, and her education.
She was always very intelligent, and she was, believe it or not, she was the strict one of my parents. And I remember the very first time ever that I got all A's in school, and she picked me up from the after-school program, and we were all playing in the gym or something. And I just remember being so anxious for her to hurry up and pick me up so I could tell her I had all A's. And she opened the door across the whole gymnasium. And I just remember dropping everything I was doing in a game or something with other kids and just running across this huge gymnasium, just full speed ahead and just screaming to my mom that I had gotten all A's and just flew in her arms. And she was very proud. She actually sent me a bouquet of flowers and a bunch of balloons and candy to my classroom the next day for me.
As Catrina Marshall grew older, she began to understand the effect that Joanne and Catrina's deaths had on her mother. They'd always visited the cemetery together when she was a child, but she remembered that as a happy time. She hadn't realized, not really, that when her mother told her stories of her aunts, she was also thinking about what had happened to them. Outside of Deborah, the Mowrey family didn't talk much about Catrina or Joanne. So it took Catrina Marshall a long time to learn the full story.
Only my mom would talk about it. And every time she did, everyone else would either shut her down, cut her off, walk away, go to a different room, or it would turn into a blowout argument, fight. It was just off topic. It was just off limits. It was an off limits topic to talk about. And by the time Joanne was killed, obviously Catrina had been dead for 8 years at that point. And so they were just pretty much thrust into the same nightmare all over again, except Joanne's murder. The only reason that murderer went to prison is because of my mom.
Catrina Marshall eventually learned that in 1993, Joanne had been murdered in Dallas in a hotel room registered to her killer, and that her mother had been in the courtroom.
She was the only one that showed up to the court hearing and testified at all. And of course, at that time, she's the breadwinner of the house, and she just got so much on her plate. And now her only other sister is brutally murdered. And they showed her the pictures of the crime scene, and she starts puking on the stand as soon as she sees them. And that, I just wish they would have never showed her those.
Difficult as that was, Deborah would have been willing to do it again for Catrina, but that time never came. Her daughter told us that as the years passed, she'd call Dallas every so often to ask for updates in her sister's case, but there was never any news. It was something that haunted her mother more than Catrina Marshall knew. Deborah struggled with depression, and though she didn't tell her daughter much about it, Catrina's case was a big part of what was weighing on her. It was something Catrina Marshall told us that Deborah often discussed in therapy. As Fox News later reported, quote, "The deaths, especially Catrina's unresolved case, destroyed her mental state. She suffered from PTSD, gory flashbacks, and hallucinations, including seeing her sister in the mirror, according to doctors' notes documented in medical records shared with Fox News Digital," end quote. We also verified those records. They were something Catrina Marshall didn't see until much later, and she wished she'd understood the full extent of her mother's grief. In 2020, the isolation of the early pandemic lockdown meant that Deborah and Catrina Marshall couldn't see each other in person. Deborah was in Arizona, and Catrina was in Kansas with her kids, but they spoke nearly every day. Catrina couldn't report to work, and she was homeschooling the children, and Deborah was alone. When Catrina checked in with her mom in early fall of that year, she mentioned that she'd called Dallas, and, as usual, there hadn't been any updates. The way Deborah spoke about it concerned Catrina.
I had a phone conversation with my mom right at the start of the pandemic, and she had mentioned that she had called for an update or whatever from Dallas PD, and they said that there was no update still. And I don't know what it was about that time exactly, but something went off in my brain or something. Maybe it was intuition or just a spidey sense or something. I was on a lunch break one day from work, and we were talking about it real quick because, we talked every single day. We talked all the time, every day, whether it was Facebook Messenger, text, call, whatever. She'd call me on my work phone if I did not answer. Like, we were always in touch. But basically, she had said something along the lines of, on my lunch break, during our conversation, she mentioned something about I reached out to Dallas police again today to see if there were, any updates. And she's like, they still don't have anything. And, she's kind of really bummed out. At that point, I was like, Mom, why don't you let me call him? I'm an adult now. And she was so emotional still and just traumatized about it that if they told her, we don't have any updates, she'd be like, okay, thanks, bye. She just almost didn't want the details even because they were too hard for her.
That's when Catrina Marshall began her official communication with the Dallas Police Department. She has an extensive timeline of the events of her aunt's case. In fact, she has records of just about everything, so she can pinpoint when she made that first call, September 9th, 2020. What followed were more calls and emails and communication that established that Catrina Mowrey's case file was archived. As we told you last episode, Deborah and Catrina Marshall received word that Catrina Mowrey's file was classified as a, quote, non-murder and not readily available to investigators. Deborah, who'd been calling for updates all those years, was confused. Catrina Marshall put in 2 requests. First, she wanted her aunt's death certificate. Then she filed a FOIA to receive a copy of the initial police report filed in Catrina's case. They wanted the death certificate because the official document lists some information that can be pertinent in the case, like the manner and cause of death. FOIA can take a long time to fulfill, but the death certificate was a simpler matter. After all, they were relatives. By October 9th, 2020, it had arrived in the mail in Kansas. And Catrina told us that her mother had been checking in with her every single day.
She's like, I want you to send it to me as soon as you get it. And as soon as I got it and I opened it and I saw it, I was like, I just knew it was going to push her over the edge. And it did. It just said that the cause of death or manner of death was undetermined following investigation, autopsy, and toxicology. And so it wasn't even classified as a homicide or anything at that point. It was just undetermined. So it's kind of in this gray space or gray area of neglect, I guess. But why they would have never communicated that is beyond me.
It's likely that by 2020, officials involved in Catrina Mowrey's case back in 1985 would have long retired from Dallas Police Department. Current investigators may not have had the details regarding why choices were or weren't made, or insight into early assumptions or what was communicated to the media. We've spoken to plenty of cold case investigators who've told us how difficult it can be to piece together a case or follow the trails of what was done or not done decades later. But Catrina Marshall, she was most confused by what her mother understood to be true, that all those years, someone was still looking into her Aunt Catrina's case. If Deborah's impression of her phone calls to DPD had been accurate, why hadn't anyone told her that the file was inactive and spelled out the status of her manner of death? As we told you in our last episode, we can't confirm what information DPD had, as we did not hear back from them. Catrina Marshall told Fox News that the news, quote, debilitated her mom, and they received that death certificate in early October of 2020. Deborah Mowrey Marshall took her own life on November 11th, 2020, in Arizona. Her daughter, Catrina, was unable to leave Kansas and travel there to make funeral arrangements for her mother or to see her laid to rest with her sisters.
We were doing Zoom for schooling, everyone was jobless and it was just really stressful and we were all really sick. And we were actually ordered by the state governor, to not leave our homes whatsoever under any circumstances. So I couldn't even really plan funeral, and all the funeral homes were full. I couldn't find one for my mom's body to go to because of all the COVID deaths. It was a freaking train wreck. I have no idea how, honestly, I made it through all of that time period.
Catrina told us that she was pulled back into her aunt's case in February of 2021. That's when she got notification that the FOIA she'd filed before her mother's death was finally going to be fulfilled. Most of what she had requested was denied, pending investigation. But Catrina said that she'd received what she described as a, quote, heavily redacted police report. The only information she was hoping to receive was denied, pending investigation. So she decided to call and try and find out more.
It wasn't really anything I didn't already know. It was pretty useless, really, but at least I got it. It gave me a purpose, I think. It kind of gave me something to focus on, to somehow kind of honor my mom or at least give some closure to her memory. And I guess that's kind of how I see it. Justice for her.
It took Catrina a long time to piece together the information she now has on her aunt's case. She's spoken with officials, sent emails, made calls, organized petitions, obtained court records, and put together a piecemeal collection of documents pertaining to her aunt's case. It's been hard, she said, because Catrina Mowrey's case was for all intents and purposes closed, and there were communication breakdowns along the way. But she slowly put together a dossier that represented the investigation as it was in 1985. We'll start with the circumstances of Catrina Mowrey's death. We told you last episode that when her apartment was searched, it was noted that there was no forced entry. Her suitcase and her glasses were also recovered in the apartment. Something else that Catrina Marshall found, though, was mention of a roommate who'd spoken with the police and said that she'd last seen Catrina Mowrey on Sunday, June 24th. This was confusing because the apartment manager had clearly told police that the Ford had been parked in the alley behind the business on Saturday, June 23rd. But Catrina thinks she might have an answer to that.
I'm not totally convinced there is a female roommate at this point. I know there was another girl that went missing and ended up being found dead the same exact day that my aunt was killed. And that was mentioned as the exact name of the roommate on the reports. And so personally, my opinion is that they were working both cases at the same time. Paperwork got mixed up or something, and someone accidentally wrote down the other girl's name on the investigation paperwork somewhere.
According to Catrina Marshall's notes on the case, in July of 2023, she received communication from Dallas PD that they no longer believe that the woman, the roommate, who at one point been identified by name, was ever living with Catrina Mowrey. So, while we don't have clear answers there, her niece's theory seems plausible. with two very similar cases occurring in Dallas at the same time. It's possible a few details were crossed in the files. That is something that we've seen before. Some of the other key information she uncovered came in the form of her aunt's toxicology results. We shared those with you last episode, but it wasn't information the family had until Catrina Marshall began her work. Her mother, Deborah, had never believed Catrina Mowrey had died of a drug overdose, and based on this paperwork, that was confirmed. According to Fox, quote, toxicology report was clean. There were no drugs or alcohol in her system, and those results were published by the newspaper when they covered Catrina Mowrey's case. That information confirmed what Catrina Marshall had already believed. Through her own research and continued advocacy, she also learned more details about the crime scene. She knew her aunt had been discovered in the trunk of a car, but not some of the details that, to her, pointed clearly to foul play. As Fox reported, quote, the police report noted a belt was tied around her neck, and her nude body was wrapped in a bedsheet with a second belt. That detail, that there had been ligatures below and above the sheet, was further indication that someone had inflicted harm on Catrina beyond hiding her body after an accident or a natural death. But there were no other clear signs of injury. As Fox noted, after days in the Dallas heat, quote, the level of decomposition was so bad, police were not able to note visible, superficial marks or wounds. We haven't been able to review her autopsy in detail, so we don't know what injuries, if any, were discovered. But Catrina Marshall did find that note in the file that we told you about last time, that just a few days after her aunt was discovered, a supplemental investigation form was added to the report. It noted that her case was being investigated as a homicide, though we don't know if that opinion changed or how the final decision of undetermined was made, considering the context of the crime scene. As we told you earlier in the episode, Deborah had already told her daughter about her suspicions regarding one man in Catrina Mowrey's life, her old friend Pee-wee. But as Catrina Marshall gained more knowledge of the case, she learned of two other possible persons of interest, the men that we're calling John and Alex. We've already told you a little about Alex. He's the one who broke into the apartment on May 30th. The 911 call that Catrina placed led to a police report that helped her niece verify her aunt's address, and she was also able to learn more about the man who had threatened her aunt. She went over some of her research with us during her interview.
So this says the person calling or reporting it was Catrina Mowrey. So some of the records have her as Catrina specifically and not Catherine at all, and some just have Catherine. So I had to really go back once I realized that and kind of search both. Because sometimes, like even her obituary was under Catrina, it never came up under Catherine. So now it's kind of crazy. But anyway, Dallas PD had told me that they didn't know her exact address, which is so weird because just 3 weeks before she was found dead, this report has her address listed right on it. So it says that it was May 30th of 85 and that the arrestee status was surrendered, and it has his home address. And that's how I found out he was married, actually.
There's no evidence that Alex and Catrina were in a relationship, though that is certainly a possibility, and Catrina Marshall doesn't rule it out. What is certain is that they had a conflict in the weeks before her death. When he was found in Catrina's apartment, he was arrested and found to have an outstanding warrant for another offense, a speeding ticket in another jurisdiction. However, Catrina Mowrey, she was hesitant to pursue anything regarding the break-in in her apartment.
So, I don't know, maybe he threatened her or something. I know that when I asked my uncle about it, he's like, she just really didn't want to be involved with the police at all. And I know that Joanne had been in trouble before this, kind of using her identity for a couple of situations. God, she's like everybody's identity. This girl could work the system like no one I've ever seen. It probably wouldn't fly now because of all the technology we have that would catch that. But like, man, she would use like the alternate spellings of the Mowrey name and just kind of like wiggle her way out of anything.
Catrina Marshall thinks that might have been one of the factors that kept her aunt from pursuing charges with the police. Or it could have been connections in her own life. She hasn't been able to figure out if her aunt actually owed Alex money or whether that was simply an excuse they gave law enforcement when officers arrived at the scene.
I don't put anything off the table. I'm not saying that it wasn't over a drug or something. I don't know. I just want to figure out who's responsible. You know what I mean?
When Catrina Marshall began to dig deeper into Alex, she discovered that he died some years after her aunt, so he couldn't be re-interviewed in regard to her death. But she's unclear as to whether he was ever questioned at all after Catrina Mowrey's body was discovered. And that worries her because the two had a violent encounter just 2 weeks before her aunt was found dead. The third and final person of interest that Catrina dug into was perhaps the most important in terms of the details of the actual crime scene. The owner of the Ford LTD. That's the car her aunt's body was found in, and the person, as far as she knows, who the police spoke with most extensively after the fact. Based on what Catrina Marshall understands, he was allegedly a known figure in the Dallas drug scene at the time, and someone who had power and influence. Her aunt was likely dating this man, the man we're calling John, at the time, and we don't have any reports of them having issues or conflicts. In fact, she had the long-term loan of that same car in the summer of 1985, and it was the vehicle that she'd planned to take to Kansas. But the association itself, that could have been dangerous. Catrina Marshall said that she discovered that John was married, and that he had an extensive criminal record, something that we were able to verify through the records that she'd gathered. She doesn't think that he would have been angry over her aunt keeping his car for an extended period of time, as John had multiple modes of transportation. But there were other things that she could have known about, or been exposed to, that might have put her in danger, even unintentionally.
We're talking like he was a big time drug dealer. Like he has federal felony charges from selling drugs to like undercover like federal agents and whatnot. However, they said he had an airtight alibi and was not questioned further. I don't know how much they confirmed or how much they looked into that alibi or if they just took his word for it.
Even if he had that airtight alibi, there were people who could have been angry at John, who decided to take revenge through Catrina, leaving her in his car that could have been seen as a message. It's one of the many things that frustrates her niece. She feels like there were so many avenues of the case that went uninvestigated 40 years ago that could have led to answers for her mother and for her grandmother, for the whole family. But with decades gone past, witnesses and persons of interest have died or moved or disappeared. But that doesn't mean that things are hopeless, not by a long shot. Through Catrina Marshall's own advocacy, there's been a re-examination of her aunt's case. And 2 years ago, evidence was located and sent for DNA testing. As of the recording of this episode, she is still waiting to hear of those results. In March of 2023, Dallas Police Department put out their first ever public call for information in the case of Catrina Mowrey. It ran across their social media, and it's a start. But her niece won't rest until she sees answers. She has to know what happened, not only for her aunt, but also for her mother, Deborah. It's only since then that she's come to understand how Deborah's life was haunted by Catrina and by Joanne's murders, and the fact that she couldn't give Catrina the same justice that Joanne got.
The hardest part that I had to deal with when she died was that I never realized just how much it had affected her on a daily basis over time and how much it shaped who she was as a person individually, like how much it influenced that. And it also kind of made me grateful in a way that she made sure that I wasn't going to be affected like that and that I was sheltered. Yeah, she was really great. I mean, her mental health definitely declined a lot there at the end, and she was a little sporadic and stuff, but I knew why. It's really, really sad when you really look back, especially at the like records and stuff. It's just so obvious. That's what ignited a lot of the fire that I have about this case, because I feel like it could have been avoided, even if they had not solved this case.
When her aunt's case is solved, Catrina says that she'll be able to lay her mother to rest in their family plot. Right now, Joanne and Catrina Mowrey share a headstone with their ashes interred side by side. And she wants to bury Deborah there too, in the same graveyard where they'd visit Deborah's sisters when she was a child.
So she'll be buried with her sisters eventually. I still have her remains in my possession, so I don't really want to add her to the whole plot with them two until I know she can really rest in peace, you know? I feel like once I get some kind of closure on this case, then she can peacefully rest there with her sisters.
Catherine Catrina Mowrey's case is still cold, but it is solvable. Although we have not released the names of the persons of interest because they have not been released by law enforcement, we know there are people still alive in Dallas who knew Catrina and may have information regarding what happened to her on the weekend of June 22nd, 1985. If you have any information in the unsolved death of Catherine Catrina Mowrey, please contact Dallas Police at coldcase@dallaspolice.gov. Next time on the Fall Line, we're covering another Dallas case, the death of Armani Dante Morgan, who disappeared after he was violently assaulted in June of 2017, and whose remains were discovered blocks away from his family's Oak Cliff apartment. If you know of a case that should be covered on the Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcast, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure that you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere now. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Engineered and scored by Southern Gothic Media and Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.